Welcome to this morning's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to the panelists. With that, I will turn it over to ASP CEO, Patrick Costello.
Thank you. Good morning from Washington. Welcome to this morning's conversation. The climate crisis has widely been recognized as the primary challenge of our time. The Biden administration has stated that climate change is the greatest threat facing our country and the world, and the president has mobilized a whole of government effort to reduce climate pollution in every sector of the economy and increase resilience to climate impact. NATO recognizes climate change as an overarching challenge of our time that will measurably increase the risks to security and worsen as the world warms further. In its recent strategic concept, NATO calls for a fundamental transformation of the alliance's approach to defense and security and sets NATO as a leading international organization in understanding and adapting to climate change. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recognizes the challenge as paramount and has warned that we are still off track in addressing the climate crisis, which is an amplifier of global injustice and inequality. Guterres recently said that humanity faces a collective suicide over the climate crisis. So the alarm bells are ringing and the red lights are flashing. But if you already consider climate change a pressing issue, you might not think carefully about the way you talk about it. And there's a communications challenge here. Messages need to be calibrated to a variety of audiences. The inherent complexity of climate change, from the science to the psychology, needs to be framed appropriately. There's also the challenge of disinformation and misinformation that must be tackled. Joining us this morning to discuss effective tactics and messages for communicating about climate change, the history and challenge posed by disinformation in this space, and how to inoculate ourselves from climate misinformation are three highly regarded scholars. W Maibach is a distinguished professor at George Mason University and director of its Center for Climate Change Communication. At the center, Dr. Maibach and his colleagues work to develop and apply social science insights to help society make informed decisions that will stabilize the Earth's life-sustaining climate and prevent further harm from climate change. Dr. Maibach, welcome.
Hey, Patrick, thanks for having me.
We also have Dr. David Benac, an associate professor of history at Western Michigan University. His research at the intersection of environmental and public history investigates how individuals and communities develop cultural ties to environments and how these connections emerge in grassroots activism. Dr. Benac, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for including me. I look forward to this conversation.
Great. Also joining us is Dr. Ann Armstrong. She's syncing up presently. Dr. Armstrong was the lead author of the 2018 book entitled Climate Change Communication, a Guide for Educators. Her research areas include climate change communication, environmental education, and how urban environmental stewardship and positive youth development build identity and empower youth to contest place stigma. Dr. Armstrong, welcome.
Thank you very much, and my sincere apologies for my tardiness here.
No, you're fine. Thank you so much. To our guests on the line, as mentioned earlier, throughout this conversation, please feel free to use the chat and Q&A functions to submit your questions, and I'll weave them in. If you'd like to be identified with your affiliation, please provide that as well. Thank you all for joining us. Let's get started. Dr. Armstrong, I'll pose the first question to you. Now, on the surface, climate change communication is about educating and informing, warning and persuading, mobilizing and solving this critical problem. But at a deeper level, climate change communication is shaped by different experiences. Different areas experience the effects of climate change differently, whether it's the increasing frequency and ferocity of hurricanes on the East Coast, or wildfires in California, or drought in the Southwest. So can you share your views on effective communications tactics and how to calibrate messaging effectively?
Sure, and thanks again for having me today. I'm really pleased to be here. So I think there are a few key things to remember when thinking about effective climate change communication and education in general. And one of those is that just information in and of itself, just giving people information isn't enough to get people to do what you might want them to do with regards to climate action. So we have lots and lots and lots of information floating around out there. And in general, 70% of the public, according to the Yale Climate Change Communication Project, believes that climate change is happening, and over half of the public in the United States thinks that it's anthropogenic. So there's pretty broad consensus. But information and even positive attitudes toward climate change action do not necessarily lend themselves to actually acting. And so I think that one of the key things that we've been working on with the Civic Ecology Lab at Cornell University is not just thinking about, okay, how do we get the information out, but it's more thinking about who are our different audiences and what is the nature of the information that they need. If we think about, again, going back to Yale's work and global warming, the 6 Americas of global warming, where they've split up. We have these 6 different kind of publics in the United States that think about global warming and climate change in very different ways. And if your audience is on the alarmed end of that spectrum, then you're not going to have to give them information about greenhouse gases. They're already there. They understand that. They want to know, they need action efficacy. They need to know about how they can act. What's the best way that they can address climate change? And they're not going to respond well to turn off your lights, recycle more. They understand the gravity of the situation. And so this is where action competence and really working on giving people something to hang on to if your audience is in that segment is important. Whereas if you have somebody on the dismissive side of that spectrum, then your goals have to become somewhat different, and you have to lean more towards just getting people involved in the conversation, and building some basic climate literacy, trying to find consensus on basic local issues. So I guess that's where I'll start, because I could go on and on, but I know that our other panelists have lots to say.
No, that's a great place to start. And I'm also just struck by this 6 different publics breakdown. And I think beliefs are shaped by social groups people consider themselves to be a part of. Now, we're all simultaneously members of many social groups based, for example, on political or religious affiliation or occupation. And the issue of climate change has broken down along partisan lines, becoming a Democrat versus Republican issue. So I guess, Dr. Maibach, I'll pose this to you. So how do we communicate with individuals who are part of a social group that is skeptical about climate or outright denying climate change?
Yeah, great question, Patrick. And to your earlier point, in this hyper partisan polarized world in which we're currently living, it's pretty easy to be successful in targeting and tailoring messages to specific audiences, which then go viral within that tribe, that audience, if you will. But that's, unfortunately, it's not really what we want to accomplish. If we want to have a serious, measured, thoughtful conversation about the nature of our challenges and the best policy solutions to address those challenges. So the 6 global warming 6 Americas, of which came out of our team at George Mason and Yale, we did identify 6 distinct groups, 6 distinct ways of thinking about the problem out there. But as you said, Patrick, the single most important determinant of what places people in each of those 6 categories along the continuum from alarmed to dismissive is their political ideology, is whether or not they are a liberal Democrat, that would be many of the alarmed, or a conservative Republican, that would be virtually all of the dismissive. So in order to find ways of starting a conversation, a public dialogue that actually can engage people across that continuum of beliefs, you got to work a little hard at it, right? You can't, I mean, unless of course you're Putin's web trolls, in which case your objective is to drive those ends further apart, create more polarization. But from an American security perspective and an American human health perspective, which is the perspective I bring to this because I'm a public health professional, or frankly, any one of a variety of different American perspectives on this challenge that we call global warming, we need to find ways of having a reasonable conversation across as many of those audiences who are willing to participate. It's hard, but we do know, for example, from a human health perspective, we do know that from our research, we've shown that even members of the dismissive segment, conservative Republicans who have been brainwashed largely by Fox News, into believing that climate change is not real or is not human caused or is not serious and is in fact a government plot hatched by Al Gore and then continued to be perpetuated by Barack Obama. Even they really engage in thinking about climate change as a health issue, or the nature of the way that we create our energy as a health issue. So dirty members of the dismissive segment, they get the fact that dirty fuel, fossil fuel, you burn it, you pollute your air and your water, you harm the health of your child who has asthma, you make your father-in-law's life more difficult because the poor guy has chronic obstructive lung disease and he spends a part of his day with, carrying an oxygen tank with him. So the answer to your question is, we have to find conversations that people across the political continuum and across the Six Americas continuum are actually willing to have on a rational actor basis.
Great, thank you. You bring up Putin's web trolls, so I want to pivot slightly to talk about misinformation. Now, in February of this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change took an unprecedented step in citing mis and disinformation and the politicalization of science as key barriers to action. For the first time, a document accepted by all member governments stated that rhetoric from, quote, vested economic and political interests undermines climate science, and in turn has driven public misperception of climate risks and polarized public support for climate actions. This diagnosis was explicit and building on a growing body of evidence produced across environmental and research sectors in recent years. To solve the climate crisis, we need to tackle the information crisis. So I have several questions related to that, and I'll pose them to Dr. Benac first, and then welcome comments from the rest. First, how widespread is climate disinformation? Who are the main perpetrators in spreading disinformation? What is the type of mis and disinformation being spread? Is it junk science, climate denialism, or attacks on climate figures, or all of the above? There was analysis put out this summer by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which is a London-based anti-hate think tank, warning that these narratives infiltrate general discourse and stances on climate actions are entrenching into the broader individual identity and grievance politics, and it's emerging as a new front in the culture war. So I just welcome comments on that. And I guess, and to something you brought up earlier, I think the taxonomy of harm relating to climate mis and disinformation has been poorly defined to date, and providing an inadequate basis for response. I welcome, that's a lot of questions I tossed out there. You can pick and choose, but Dr. Benac, I'll turn to you first and then welcome comments from the rest of the group.
Yeah, thank you. You're right. That's a lot of questions to deal with, and that's a lot of material to cover. We've got three academics here, so each of us could take hours on any of those questions. So just to put that in context of some of the things that our other panelists talked about, if we want to talk about the information, we're talking about the science for the most part. And the science, like, where did climate change science start? You go back to the 1820s. By the 1820s, we had the basics starting to be figured out. It was relatively a linear progression up through the 1960s and 1970s with continuing discoveries, reinforcing what we had already learned. You can make a pretty solid argument on the evidence that exists that by the late 1960s, even early 1960s, we pretty much had the science of climate change. It's the details we're working out. What feedback loops do what, how exactly how bad or how, but we had the science was pretty well worked out by the 1960s. What happened though, is that ran into a couple of different things that caused misinformation to become widespread. One of those was global technology. During the 1970s, it started in the 40s, but during the 1970s, you had people starting to notice that there was a measurable decline in global temperature. There actually was during the 1970s. It actually proceeded through like the 50s into the very early 80s. It was fractions of a degree. It wasn't much, but there was a measurable decline in global temperature, and it destroyed all of the consensus in the public's opinion about the existence of global warming as it was known then. What we know with more research is that the reason that happened is because in the 40s through the 80s, you had a record level of tropical deforestation, and you had a record level of the production and use of CFCs, the ozone depleting gases. Those two things are, the tropical deforestation is characterized by burning. So you had the burning of forests on a very large scale. You had CFCs, both of which create particulate matter. That particulate matter gets in the atmosphere, creates almost like a shade curtain, and it drew down the temperature. But while that was happening, you still had the production of CO2. So you had a hidden climate change that was still taking place. So that caused a rational position of denial. Somebody looking at that could say, okay, these scientists are showing that temperature's actually decreasing. Should I believe the scientists who are using measurements, or should I believe the scientists who are using theory? So there was a rational reason for denial at that point. That also happened to be the point when Reagan is elected. We can't blame this all on Reagan. He's a bigger part of a neoconservative, neoliberal change in politics, which put corporate profits and welfare above regulations and the health of people and the health environment. And that's the point where politics and environmental policy, particularly climate policy, become intertwined. Because that's the point where Senator Tsongas, when he was there, Senator Gore, and others began having hearings in Congress about climate change, which at the same time that Reagan was pushing against this. So this became just one more factor in the 1980s, creating that culture war. So that's really where we see the origin of this resistance to climate science. I would argue, though, that the general consensus of what we know about science and climate science has been accepted pretty much in the last 10 years. And in the last 10 years or so, we're not really fighting against understanding the science. You don't really see a whole lot of people saying the science is false. And there, of course, there are some people. And that's what I would call the active denial. People who are saying that it's not happening. But I would argue that passive denial is a bigger problem today. And passive denial, as I would talk about it, is a failure of solutions commensurate to the scale of the problem. You recognize that climate change is real. You recognize that it's a crisis. You recognize that it's going to destabilize the entire human civilization, but you try to address it with incentives to buy more electric cars. I live in a community where there's no real action, even though about 2 years ago we had a climate crisis declared. But all that's really happened is we installed bike lanes, while at the same time offered tax credits for the expansion of a business in town that in its application said it's going to increase its greenhouse gas emissions by 221%.
Wow.
That is passive denial. That is saying there's a climate crisis, but taking actions that are going to make it worse.
Thanks, Dr. Benac. I do want to invite comments from Dr. Armstrong and Dr. Maibach, but Dr. Benac, that historical picture you painted is incredibly useful. And I would also just flag for our guests on the line. The work of Nathaniel Rich, his book, Losing Earth, A Recent History, provides a fantastic, really deep dive into the historical picture that Dr. Benac just painted. So Dr. Armstrong, I'll turn to you just to provide brief thoughts, insights on disinformation and misinformation. And then Dr. Maibach, I know you've thought deeply on this issue as well.
Yeah, thanks. In bringing this into the climate change education world, there's been some really interesting work done by Nathaniel Geiger and Janet Swim on the notion of the spiral of science or the spiral of silence in climate change education. That means that educators aren't always able to counter misinformation because they're afraid that if they even just talk about climate change, it's going to be politically, it's going to be kind of explosive, and they're going to run into uncomfortable conversations. And so there's been some really interesting, so that kind of just perpetuates this silence around climate change. And I think Dr. Maibach's work with Yale and George Mason has also shown that people just don't talk about climate change all that much in their daily conversations. And so that kind of, when you just have the silence, that sort of like allows things to ramify and perpetuate. So there's this fear among educators, but actually when the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation did its trainings with educators from aquaria and from zoos all over the country, educators who I spoke with and who had that experience realized that those spaces are places where they can actively engage with people on climate change because they're trusted messengers there. But anyway, so there is this with relation to education, there's a fear among educators about talking about climate change because it's so politically explosive. That doesn't do disinformation campaigns any good, or it does them well, I guess. And then in terms of the main perpetuators of disinformation in the education world, the Heartland Institute comes to mind as, I think, one of the key perpetuators of climate disinformation. They have active campaigns. They actually put together a very sinister and well done campaign in 2017 where they sent out booklets to 100,000 science teachers in the United States with climate change disinformation. And it was from something like the NIFCC, like something that looks like a respected organization, but it is not. And so there are definitely forces in the US who are trying to get the ear of climate change educators and science educators.
Thank you. Dr. Maibach, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up where Anne left off, in the sense that there absolutely is a climate silence in America and in much of the world. And as Anne suggested, part of that is because we understand that we live in a hyperpolarized world that's getting nastier and nastier with each passing day, practically. And most of us don't want to get into fights with people. Most of us, if we happen to be a middle school teacher, we don't want to hear from the parents of our children that they're unhappy with us for teaching their children about the science underlying our changing climate. So this fear, or at least aversiveness towards conflict, really is driving that climate silence. It used to be the case that the American news media were barely reporting on the issue either. That's really changed a lot in the past 5 to 10 years. I've personally been working on trying to help journalists cover the issue more routinely and more effectively. In my view of the world, more effectively means covering it as a local issue, not as a global issue. Because when you talk about any issue as a global issue, it's very abstract for people. They have a hard time paying attention. But to David's point earlier, when you talk about it as a local issue, what's going on in our community, people are much more interested in that conversation. They want to know about the impacts, they want to know what the options are for dealing with it, and they want to know, okay, well, of those options, which one are we moving forward with? And like David, I live in a community that has declared a climate crisis. Our city council declared it, I can't remember, about 4 years ago, and we've made only precious little advance over those 4 years. So really, it's incredibly important to keep to break the climate silence, to keep this in the public dialogue in a variety of different ways. And if we can do that, then it really does help us have those kind of I'm going to call them depolarizing conversations, which is exactly what we need to work towards if we want to move away from the hyperpolarization that is more, increasingly characterizing everything about our lives.
Great, thank you. I'm struck
Patrick?
by, oh, please, Dr. Benac.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up and throw a question back to the panelists to get their input on this. I'm troubled by our worry about polarization, because if you look at history, all of our good ideas that solve problems come from the fringes. How do we still have meaningful conversations that get us out of the get us off the track? We're on this track that's heading to disaster, and if we keep following it, nothing's going to change. And if we look at the polarization that exists, is it real polarization? Is it a false equivalency where we say the vocal left is the same as the violent right? And is it just an imposed, a policing of thought where we have to move towards, we all have the same position and agree on the middle? I feel like we lose something. We lose the creativity. We lose the innovative solutions if we try to steer away from those poles, which, yes, they can be divisive, but that's also where the ideas come from.
Dr. Maibach, why don't we go to you first and then Dr. Armstrong? It's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. And I'm not a political scientist, or a political theorist. I'm a communication scientist. So a couple of years back, right when the Green New Deal was first being proposed by the political left, AOC and others, and David, I think this is to your point, and we happened to be in the field within, I don't know, weeks of this becoming part of the national conversation. And it takes a long time for most people to pay attention to what's going on in the national conversation. So we asked people in our poll, to what degree do you support or oppose the ideas in this thing called the Green New Deal? We actually first asked, have you ever heard of the Green New Deal? And only 15% had even heard the name, and only about 5% felt like they even knew anything about it. So almost no one heard anything about it. But when we described it in 3 simple, clear sentences, I think we had 81% of the American voting population said, yes, they support this. And then because we got lucky, the timing of our next poll 6 months later, 5.5 months after Fox News made the Green New Deal their absolute unrelenting target to tear it down, destroy it, rip it up from the roots. And we went back in and we asked the very same questions. And what we learned is that among Democrats, support for the awareness of the Green New Deal was now through the roof, and support for it was a little bit higher, but since they were already so supportive of the idea, they couldn't really go much higher. But among conservatives, awareness of it went much higher. But among conservative Republicans, 51% of whom previously said this is a good idea, it dropped down to, I think, 4% said it was a good idea. So I agree with you, David. What makes any nation great is a diversity of ideas, but we also need the ability to actually talk about those ideas as opposed to hate each other more as a result of ideas that come from the other side. So that piece of research I just described, we just got lucky. We caught Fox News in the act of murdering the Green New Deal in the minds of virtually everybody on the conservative right. And I would contend that that's a problem.
Dr. Armstrong, your thoughts on polarization?
Yeah, I think that, so it's hard to follow those responses up, but I'm going to do my best here. One of the things that I was thinking about with regard to that question, David, is that there's that difference between having a spectrum of ideas and being polarized by like being entrenched in so entrenched in your political groups that you're not, like as Dr. Maibach said, that you're not even able to come to the table. So for example, I think of Bob Inglis, the Republican who was voted out of office in, I think, 2011, because he supported climate change. Sorry, say that again?
Former congressman from South Carolina.
Yes, who had gone on a trip to Antarctica and with his son and really came to be concerned about climate change. And so he's very conservative and has started his own climate change organization called Republic EN that really focuses on free market climate solutions. So, that's very different from AOC's climate Green New Deal, but there's probably somewhere where they can agree on something, right? Like they can have a conversation. And so I think that to echo what Dr. Maibach was saying is that it's just that the polarization becomes a huge problem when you're just so your identity, it becomes so entrenched in these different views that you can't even begin to accept what the other side might, and the fact that we're even calling it the other side, right? Might be saying.
Right. Well, I want to pivot slightly. Dr. Maibach, I was struck by when you mentioned earlier that you work with journalists on how to effectively communicate about this. And I'm thinking, local meteorologists are probably better positioned than anyone to talk to their communities about the effects of climate change. I know polls show that local television weathercasters are among the most trusted of media figures. So can you talk a bit about the role of weathercasters, meteorologists as climate messengers? It strikes me that they can be quite effective at making a crisis that seems distant and abstract feel a bit more real. And they're also quite visible and credible.
Yeah, all of that is exactly right. And when we conducted our first climate change in the American Mind poll way back in the fall of 2008, and as soon as we published the findings of that poll in the spring of 2009, my office phone rang, and it was a very famous local TV weathercaster on the line by the name of Joe Whitty. And in our poll, we found that TV weathercasters were one of the most trusted sources of information about global warming. And Joe, and then on the ABC affiliate here in DC, he thought that was really stunning. He had no idea he and his colleagues were so trusted. He called me up, he said, Ed, I need to come talk to you immediately. And so he was in my office within a few days, and he laid out the case that I had showed him that he and his colleagues are trusted. He showed me the data that proved that local, really local weathercasters, but local newscasters in general have unique access to the American people back in 2009, and still the case now in 2022. And really, it's because of the weather. Believe it or not, the weather is still the thing that gets people to turn on the local TV news. And he made the case very effectively. It's something I should have known instantly. Look, we get our jobs as TV weathercasters because we're good science communicators. This is how we get our job. This is how we advance in our careers. And so he sort of talked about this beautiful confluence of factors: trust, access, and communication skill. And he said, you and I, Ed, we had to work together to do outreach to my colleagues around the country and get them engaged in this work. And we wrote a grant together, an NSF grant. We've been doing this work together since 2009. But a really important first learning from that work was that in 2010, when we conducted the first ever truly nationally representative survey of TV weathercasters, they were actually more skeptical of human-caused climate change than were the American people at large in 2010. And the reason is, and foreshadowed it perfectly, the reason is they had been the target of a misinformation campaign by the Heartland Institute and others for quite some time. And there was a historical reason for that, and David foreshadowed that beautifully. Back in 1998, I believe it was, Bill Clinton and Al Gore invited 100 weathercasters to the White House to pitch them on educating the American people about the local relevance of human-caused climate change. And they left it at that. But the Heartland Institute didn't leave it at that. They thought, oh my God, that was such a brilliant idea. We're going to make these people, America's TV weathercasters, a target of our persuasion campaign. So when we came along with NSF funding and realized, oh my gosh, this community is so surprisingly divided on this issue, we actually made that part of our objective, try to find a way to bring this community together. And over the past 12 years now working with them, they have come together. They have come to realize that those who thought that it wasn't, climate change is not real or is not human caused or is not serious, that misperception, that misinformation has been neutralized. And now as a community, they are leaning in so effectively to educate their viewers about the local relevance of climate change. We had a paper published just yesterday in a journal called Climatic Change, in which we looked at the predictors of which Americans tell us they've changed their mind about global warming over the past couple of years. And a fair number, every time we ask that question, a fair number of people tell us they've changed their mind. And one of the strongest predictors is people's personal experiences of global warming or their vicarious experiences, meaning what they know, how they know global warming has influenced other people they care about, and also whether or not they've heard TV weathercasters talking about climate change. So we actually have a whole bunch of different lines of evidence to support that once weathercasters started leaning in on this issue, it really changed the direction of public understanding of climate change in America in the right direction.
Great. So they're incredibly effective messengers. And we talked about this briefly, but I want to dive down a bit deeper just as we're thinking about messengers, and that is the role of educators. And we've mentioned that they face formidable challenge when they approach climate change due to not only the complexity of science, but also the political and cultural contexts and the communities in which their students live. So you were the lead author of the 2018 book entitled Communicating Climate Change, a Guide for Educators. What are some of the main lessons and tips you provided?
So and some of them have already been covered in this talk, but one of them is really understanding, first, just really understanding where your people are. What's your starting line? What are your students already know? If you're working, and I actually have a professional background as a non-formal environmental educator. So I think about education in the school systems as well as education through nature centers and museums and the media and all of those other spots where you might gain information. But so where are people starting? What is your community like? And then thinking about the local issues, as we've been mentioning, that might resonate with people. And so, for example, I interviewed a woman who worked with foresters in North Carolina, and she was able to get them on board with thinking about climate change and forestry because the Journal of Forestry that they trusted and their professional organization had published about it. And they had all of this direct experience with increased pests and pest issues due to forestry. So finding those, I think we talk a lot in the book about different ways of framing or the different storylines that you might draw out that have some relevance to your audience. And I think educators are, in different aquaria, and educators are, aquariums, zoos, museums, those kind of community organizations are really well placed because they're already there as research translators. They are really well tapped into what their community knows and likes. And they are seen as trusted messengers of scientific information, particularly at zoos and aquaria. Teachers in the public school system, there was a survey in 2016 by Eric Plutzer that demonstrated that about 51% at that time of the U.S. science teachers were teaching about anthropogenic climate change, and about 30% were not teaching about it at all, or there was some kind of denial, and this was in part predicted by political affiliations. And so public school teachers, I think, because they deal directly with teachers, they have some other hurdles to cross. But in another systematic review of climate change education, teachers who do teach about climate change find that when they really talk about local, like things that students that feel really relevant to students, and they use participatory methods and active learning techniques, those are the things that are really effective.
Great. Thank you. We've only got a few minutes left. I'd like to just pivot slightly to talk about climate activism. Now, we've seen a lot of climate activism in recent years. There are groups like Extinction Rebellion, which have advocated for the use of nonviolent civil disobedience to promote climate action. And there are individual activists like Greta Thunberg who have gained sizable followings. And looking at these movements, to me, they appear largely youth-driven, but I understand that the Center for Climate Change Communication did a deep dive into this issue of activism and nonviolent civil disobedience last year. So Dr. Maibach, I'll pose this question to you. Who's willing to participate in nonviolent civil disobedience for the climate? And then Dr. Benac, I would also love your comments because I know you've thought a lot about the connections that emerge in grassroots activism. So Dr. Maibach, over to you first.
Yeah, let me start with sort of a contextual response, which is I'm not an expert in social movements, but social movement experts, I read their work, and I'm absolutely convinced from their work that, you know, visible shows of commitment on the part of people who care deeply about an issue, those move the social movements forward, and those have a tangible effect on policymakers. If you have, to David's point earlier, you might show overwhelming support of the population for, you know, policy proposal X, but if people aren't actually reaching out to their legislators or doing sit-ins, you know, in the nation's capital, like a handful of Democratic staffers actually did a takeover of Chuck Schumer's office last week. I mean, it was unprecedented. Never happened before. No, I never in my lifetime thought it would happen, but these audacious young people did it to show how concerned they are and how committed they are to seeing real U.S. Congress take real climate action. So at any rate, the second point I want to make is that a large proportion of Americans are really deeply concerned about climate change. Right now, it's about 7 out of 10 of us they answer our polls to tell us they are worried about global warming. But we see very, very low levels of participation in what we call civil disobedience. So let me just read you the question that we ask people on our surveys. We say that if a person you liked and respected asked you to, would you support an organization engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience against corporate or government activities that make global warming worse? And then so that's essentially, do you support organizations like the Sunrise Movement, for example? And then we follow that one up with the next question, which is the same format, but we ask people, would you, if a person you trust or respected asked you to, would you personally engage in nonviolent civil disobedience? What we find is about 3 out of 10 people say that yes, they would support an organization engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience, and about 15% of our survey respondents say they would personally engage. Needless to say, the alarmed segment of the population is much more likely to say yes to both of those questions. But the point I want to leave you with is there are a lot more Americans, there are tens of millions of Americans who say that if asked by somebody they liked and respected to engage in civil disobedience in defense of the climate, they would do it. But we don't see anywhere near tens of millions of Americans currently engaging in civil disobedience. So there's a real gap between what people tell us they're willing to do and what they're actually doing. And I would suggest that that gap is something that advocacy organizations should be looking really hard at. You know, how well can we, or how effectively can we cultivate those people who show a certain willingness to get them to actually take action?
Right. Dr. Benac, in our closing minutes, and welcome your comments as well.
Sure. There's 3 different aspects of this I can tie up pretty neatly. The first part of it is the civil disobedience part. So I've got a manuscript under review right now that looks at the environmental civil disobedience actions in the 1980s and 90s. And you know, it is based on oral histories with dozens of people who are leaders at the moment. And almost across the board, what every one of them says in reflecting on what's going on right now is that there's a lack of a commitment to civil disobedience, recognizing that for civil disobedience to work, you have to be willing to risk. You have to be willing to be arrested. You have to be willing to take that. And that doesn't exist right now in the way that it should. Second part of that is that one of the big reasons it doesn't exist is a policy reason. Beginning in the early 1980s, the policy structure, the legal structure of the United States began to take civil disobedience and put it in the same categories as terrorism. So right now, if you stand in front of a business holding a sign and part of what you intend to do is disrupt that business's profits, you can be charged with terrorism. It's not likely to happen, but it can. Those terrorism charges can be added to that because it's harassment and intimidation. So that's another part of it. But then the last part of it, where I'll wrap this up, is those people who have access to the information. What we've been talking about is educating people. It is our moral obligation to provide that information without trying to sugarcoat it and make it seem palatable. If you look at when was our best chance to deal with climate change in the United States? It was 1979. We had real momentum going up. At that point, there was this big conference in Florida about how we were going to move forward. All these scientists got together. They all agreed that climate change was happening, that it was real, that it was a crisis. And then they couldn't decide upon how to phrase the intro, what words to use. Would they say it will happen? Would they say it's almost surely going to happen, highly likely to occur? And because they couldn't come up with a consensus, they couldn't agree on that language, the only thing that got produced from that major conference was one summary paragraph that the only person who signed it was the person who was there from the federal government to lead that conference. That was a failure. They had a moral obligation. They could have done something. And all those people who were there that I've talked to, it's only been a few, they deeply regret that. So those of us who know how bad things are, who know what's happening, who have the ability to push people, to have the ability to take those civil disobedience actions, to correct the legal corruption of the way we treat civil disobedience, we need to speak up. It's our moral obligation to show leadership and to support grassroots action.
Dr. Benac, Dr. Maibach, Dr. Armstrong, thank you all for a really wide-ranging and thoughtful conversation. I greatly appreciate you all taking the time. To our guests on the line, I hope you also found this discussion enriching, but that is all the time we have for this afternoon. I hope everyone stays well, and until next time, take care.
Thank you all. Great conversation.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Yeah, sorry, I ran us over there a little bit.
No, that was great. I greatly appreciate you all taking the time. Thank you so much.